What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the Fighting Game Tutorial Series, we are going to be going over Session List. So the Session List is the screen where we can actually view the session list. So when we come in here, if there are no sessions available, it is going to be a blank screen. But when we launch the game in standalone with two separate instances, we are able to host one session and then search for sessions with the other. So that is what we're going to be covering. That's what we're going to want to see, because once we do that, we are going to be able to actually see the sessions populate in the session list, and we're going to be able to show their session ID as the identifier right now, so we know what session it is that we're trying to join. So launching the game as standalone with two separate instances. Here we go. They are opening up. They're going to play the splash screens that we have set up. And after a second or two here, I can move my window because they're both ready to go. And I'll skip in. And in one of these, I will host. And in the other, I will join. And once the search function completes, it is going to actually add the search entry right here on the screen. And that is the session ID of the session that we found. So we know that it is working. And if we had multiple sessions that we could find, we would see multiple session IDs. Also want to give a huge thank you to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters. Thank you guys for all the love and support and for continuing to keep this series alive. I'm so excited with where we can go with this in the future. I'm glad you guys are as well. If you'd like to get caught up in the series, you can click this icon in the top right corner right here. Check out everything we've done, from attacks to movement to input buffer and everything else. Alternatively, if you just care about the online logic, the session info, session list, then you can click this icon in the top right corner right here if you want to watch the previous episode where we had set up the actual search function to search for other online sessions. With all that out of the way, we can get started on the actual episode. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial. Let's start in the blueprint because I have some logic I want to show you from the previous episode that I actually missed. So the main menu screen is where we actually trigger the online for the host and join buttons. And in the main menu screen, we have a confirm selection button that is triggered when we press our confirm input on that menu. Basically, if we are able to perform the logic on the main menu, then we get the button that was pressed or selected when we pressed the confirm, and we perform different logic on it based on what index that was. Now, the indices can also refer to pop-outs. So story is index 0, but on the online menu pop-out, so is the host button that is also index 0. So in the host episode, we had index 0 coming up here, going into a branch where we checked to see if the online menu was open. If it wasn't open, we did the story menu logic. But if it was open, then we called our host session function. We want to do the same thing for the join session or the search for sessions. So on index 1, that's our join button, we were doing our arcade mode logic when we pressed the confirm selection. But that should now only be the case if the online submenu is not open. So same for hosting, we need to check if online submenu is open. And if it's not open, or in other words, if online submenu open not is true, we want to do our regular arcade mode logic. But if it is false, then we want to call our search for sessions function that we set up in the previous episode. And to do that, we can grab our game instance reference and convert it to a validated get. So only if the game instance is valid, we can drag off of it and call the search for sessions function, in which case we will actually perform the search logic that we created in the previous episode. There is a little bit of extra logic we have in here. I'll go over this as the episode goes on. We have a few other things we have to do before we can actually do that logic. Now that that's taken care of, let's go into the code and make the function to actually display each session as they are found. So going into the code and going to the fighter template game mode.h. Now to this point, all of our online logic has been in the base game instance. However, the game mode has certain references to things like the HUD that the game instance doesn't have. So we're going to create an event in the game mode that we're going to call from the game instance, and that will allow us to display that data to the HUD or to the menus, like in this case for our session list. I'm going to scroll down in my Flutter template game mode to my blueprint implementable events. And I'm going to make a new one called void display session info. So remember that blueprint implementable events or functions that we can call in the code, but we handle all the behavior for in the blueprint. In this case, we want to call this when a session is found, and then in the menu, we want to display that session information to the user. So U function, blueprint implementable event, void display session info. Now, to pass along an F string, it's typically considered very bad to pass a string in as a copy, because if you do that, then you're copying the entire string, which could be this huge value, and passing it from function to function. So much so that Unreal and Epic have decided not to allow that to happen, and so we need to use a different method to pass this F string along. It's pretty simple, even if it looks a little bit confusing, but we want to pass F string ampersand as the type. This is just saying that it is a reference to the F string. It is not a copy of an F string. It's not a new F string being created. It's just referencing the one that we pass into this function. Additionally, it is const for constant, meaning that it's not going to change. It won't allow us to change it. And that's fine. We don't need to change it. It is the session ID that we're going to be passing. That's what we're going to use for the name. The session ID isn't really useful for the players in the majority of cases, but it is useful for us as developers, and so that will be more than enough. We don't have any reason to change it. So const f string reference, and I've called the variable session ID. Now, since it is a blueprint implementable event, we don't have to fill it out in the code, so we're good to go here. Let's go back into the editor, and let's make our widgets that we're going to use for today. So I'm going to make one called session list and session list element. To do this, I can go to add import or new and say user interface widget blueprint. Again, session list. And I've also created one called session list element. Now, going into session list, this is going to be the actual page that we spawn when we press the search or join button on the main menu. And it's going to be where we have all the sessions listed that we can join. As usual, I'll give you a quick rundown of all the designer elements if you want to make your page or your widget or screen look like this, but you don't have to. You can customize it to your liking. Since I'm in Unreal Engine 4, I get a canvas panel by default. If you're in Unreal Engine 5, you won't, but either method is okay. If you'd like to add one, you can simply type canvas panel and drag it into the highest element in your hierarchy, and you'll line up with what I have here. Now, I have a text widget called sessions text, and that is just the title of this page. I've anchored it to the top middle, and here are my positions, size to content, text of sessions. Here are my font and outline settings. Then I have a back button that I've copied from my other widgets because I use the same back button with the same functionality for pretty much all of my widgets. So I have a button that I've called back button. It is a variable, so we can end up handling it later in the blueprint. Don't have an anchor on it. Here are my positions. I've given it an image that I use for my buttons. And then there is a text widget bound to the back button. That is back button text. And these are all my details for that text. It says back. You can see the size and the outline, and you can slow this down if you want to copy any of it. Then we have an image that I've called session list background. And the session list background is anchored to the entire size of the widget, no offsets, with a z order of -1, so it displays behind everything else on this widget. Then I've changed the color and opacity to all zeros except for the alpha, which will result in this black color. And this is just to separate it from the main menu screen. You can, of course, add an actual image or incorporate it into your main menu one way or another. And those are all the design elements of the session list. Now, there is one other thing I didn't mention, and that's the most important thing on this page. This is the sessions vertical box. So we need a vertical box And once we bring that in, I've called it the sessions VB and I've made it a variable. Here are my positions for that and my sizes for that. And this is what's going to hold all of the session list elements that we create. So for each session that we find when searching, we're going to create a session list element, and then we're going to add that session list element to the session's vertical box. And this is how we're going to display this content to the user. So that's the session list design. Let's go over the session list element design. This one's a little bit simpler. So because I am in Unreal Engine 4, again, I have a canvas panel by default. It's not required that you have it, but feel free to add one if you want to. Then I have the session background, which is the actual frame of the session. This is just an image that I have. Here are my sizes. And I'm using my command list border, so I have a command list that has a frame as well. I'm using that same image, but you can obviously create a custom image. Then I have the session name text, which right now just says session name, but we are going to bind it to the session ID at the current time. That way we can read that. And that's what you saw earlier at the start of this episode. So session name text is a variable. Here are my positions. I have session name as the text, but we bind it. I'll go over that later in this episode. And here are my text settings. All right, so now we know exactly what we're working for widget-wise. Let's get into the logic. We can go to the main menu screen widget now, since we have our other widgets created. And we're going to go back to the same logic where we were calling search for sessions. And we are going to now create a new widget, and it's going to be our session list. So when we press the join button, we are going to not only call the search for sessions function, but also pull up the session list UI. So we can use the create widget node right here and select our session list as the widget we are creating. Drag off of the return value and type in add to viewport so we can actually add it to the screen. Connect this all up and you'll get the result that I have in this video. Let's go back into the session list logic and let's go into the graph. Now in session list, there's two things that I'm doing. The first thing that I'm doing is creating a reference to the session list in the game mode. This will allow the game mode to call that event that we created in the code. The other thing that I'm doing is being able to exit out of this menu and remove the session list reference from the game mode. So luckily the logic in the session list is super simple. We need event construct right here, and we need to grab our game mode and we need to set a variable. Our variable won't exist yet because we haven't created this. So let's go into our default game mode BP or base game mode BP. And I'm already at my logic, but we need to make a new variable. And when we make that variable, I called mine session list reference, and I changed the type to be our session list object reference. The session list object reference. Now don't worry about the logic you see on screen here. I'll cover that in a few minutes. But now that we have our session list reference variable in our game mode, we can go back into the session list. And in the event construct, we can get our game mode BP and set this variable. And to do that, we can literally get game mode, cast it to the default game mode BP, which is our game mode blueprint. And then we can say set session list reference. And since we are doing this in the session list, we can pass in self. So get a reference to self. And the reason we do this is because when the session list is created, we want to make sure the game mode knows about it. If we are to exit the session list, we want to remove that reference. So we want to let the game mode know that the session list reference is no longer valid. So on our back button on the session list, we can click on that and go down to the onPressed event and hit the plus to create the onPressed back button event. In here, we're going to get our game mode again. I didn't save a reference to it because there's not a lot of logic that we're doing. So I just used the same method of get game mode and then cast it to our default game mode BP. Then I say set session list reference, but you'll see this time it's empty. I'm not setting it to anything. This is the same as setting it to null pointer or just an invalid object. This will be useful because if we check for validity before using it, we'll know that if it's not valid, we've either exited the menu or we've never entered it. At that point, we can also remove from parent self, meaning that we will remove the session list from the screen. And to get this node, you literally just type remove from parent. So that is all the session list behavior finished. Now, let's go into the session list element and take a look at the behavior in there. There's nothing. There is nothing in the graph, but there's actually not just nothing. There is one thing that we need to do. It's just not related to the graph. We need to make a variable called session name. So we have our session name text, and that is this right here. But we are going to bind it to a variable so that it says whatever the session ID is. There's a few methods of doing this. I like setting a variable and using that variable to be bound to the text here. So essentially what I've done is made a variable called session name, and it is of type string. Then, after creating it, compiling, and saving, you'll be able to edit a few other options in the details panel, such as instance editable and expose on spawn. Instance editable just means that we can edit this value immediately on specific instances of this blueprint. Expose on spawn means that it will be a pin we can plug into when creating this widget. So after checking both of these, we will be able to create this widget, pass data into the session name, and then the session name will be assigned to the appropriate value. Although we haven't done this yet, we can still bind the session name text to the session name variable, and once we end up adding this logic in to assign the proper value to it, the text will automatically display whatever we assigned to the session name string. So if we go to the designer and go to our session name text, we go to content text, we can click bind, and we're going to want to pick our session name. I've already done it, so you can see it here. But if you haven't done it, you just pick this, and it will override it with this variable. So now, this text will display whatever is stored in this variable. So the next thing we need to do is set that variable. But to do that, we need to know when to create a session list element. So let's go back into the code, and let's go to our base game instance.cpp, and specifically let's go down to our search for sessions completed function. This function is where we invalidated the timer, or cleaned up the timer, and we actually printed out all of the details about how many sessions were found. So in the previous episode, we found out that we either found 0 or 1 sessions, depending on if a player was hosting a session before searching for it. I've now added a new set of logic to this function, and what it's going to do is find all of the search results and call the display session info function for each one. And to do this, we need a reference to our game mode, but don't worry, the base game instance already includes the fighter template game mode.h. If yours doesn't, because you haven't been following the series directly, you can add an include to it now, but mine already does. And so I can get it by just typing if auto game mode equals, I'm going to cast get world get auth game mode, or authority game mode. Basically get the game mode from the server. Once you do this, you cast it to a fighter template game mode, the game mode that we have the display session info function in. And if this if statement succeeds, it means that the game mode was found and cast successfully. So we have a reference to our game mode. At this point, we can loop through all of our search results and get the appropriate data, which in this case is the session ID. So we're going to do a for loop. For integer I equals 0, I is less than search settings search results.num. Remember, search settings arrow search results.num is how many search results we found. That's what we were printing to the screen and to the log in the previous episode. So we want to loop through all those elements, and then we want to increment I. Then, for each element that we find, we want to use game mode, arrow, and call display session info. Remember, it takes in a string. We want to use search settings, arrow, search results, I, so search results at the index that we're at in the for loop, dot session, which is going to get all of our information for that session. And the session has a function called getSessionID string. So we can do session.getSessionID string, and that will return the session ID as a string for us. And guess what? Display session info takes in a string, so that works out perfectly. We pass the string along, and in which case we are calling this function for all the found sessions passing in the string. So now we need to go back into the editor, and we need to go to our default game mode BP, and we need to handle this event that I told you to skip earlier. So now to grab this event, since our default game mode BP is a child of the fighter template game mode, we can just type event display session info, and it will already come in with the string. Now we want to use create widget to create the individual session list elements. So we're going to choose the class as the session list element. It will have our variable since we set it as instance editable and expose on spawn, and we can pass the string directly into the session name. At this point, we can drag off of it and we can add it to the session list. However, we haven't set this up just yet. So see how we've created our session list element. Now to add it to the VB, the vertical box, we are going to need a method of doing so. If we go back to our session list widget, go back into the graph, there was a function that we created that we didn't cover. So make a new function, and I've called it add session to list. Now it's very simple. Add session to list is going to take in a session list element as the parameter, and I've called it session to add. So I've added an input parameter. I've called it session to add, and I made it session list element object reference. Now, once you have this, we need to call add child to vertical box on our vertical box that we have. Remember that we made our vertical box a variable, and it's called sessions VB. So we need to bring that into the graph and type add child to vertical box. Now for the content, that's what we're adding to the vertical box, which is the session to add parameter. So that's how you get everything inside of this function. Now at this point, we have the ability to add a session list element to our session lists vertical box. So go back into your default game mode BP and get your session list reference. Really, we should check for validity here. So I'm going to convert it to a validated get just to make sure it's valid. And there we go. So only if the session list is valid will we do this. But once we have our session list reference, we can drag off of it and now call our new function, add session to list. And we want to pass in the return value from create session list element widget. At this point, we will now add the session list elements to the sessions vertical box for every session that was returned from the search operation. And that's how you can create your session list reference. Remember that it won't work just by joining because you have no sessions, and it also won't work with two players running a new editor window because they count as the same session. So if I am to make this bigger and have two methods, I can host here and I can try and join here, but there's not going to be a session found. You can see that each window says search started. They're really being considered the same session. So you'll have to run them as standalone if you want to test this. But now everything in your session list window should pop up and should work as expected. And it will have a random ID for the session ID. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about not knowing what that value means. We will go over how we can use that and be more useful with that information as we get it. But now we know we can create data in our session list from that, and that will allow us to do a lot more in the future. So anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe, and please consider checking out the YouTube membership or Patreon, or just sending a donation my way with super thanks. Really appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much for everything. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I would be happy to help you out, and it is completely free. But otherwise, guys, that is all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.